All right, everyone. So my name is Jesse, and welcome back to Conservation Stories Canada interviews. Over the next year, I'll be featuring amazing stories from conservation leaders coast to coast doing incredible work to protect wild species and wild places. Today, I am joined by Dr. James Paterson. So his work allows him to connect with government officials at the provincial, city, federal level in working to protect reptile and amphibian species across Canada. He's currently at Trent University near Peterborough. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Paterson. I really appreciate you being here with me.
Thanks so much, Jesse. Excited to be here.
Awesome. So when going around, I've been to provincial and federal parks my entire life, and I very seldom run into reptiles or amphibians. I've seen a few turtles here and there. I've chased through the bush to grab a garter snake or two. Could you explain a little bit about the reptile diversity and the amphibian diversity in Canada? Like what is the backdrop here to your work?
So reptiles and amphibians, obviously, in Canada, it's a relatively cold climate. So most of the species reach that northern limit to their distribution in Canada. And so we have maybe a less diverse community of reptiles and amphibians than, for example, the United States or many of the tropical areas. But we still have a relatively diverse community. So for example, in Southern Ontario, we have 8 different types of turtles. And on the West Coast, there's also a number of unique species that occur in sort of the warmer climates. And so even though we're a cold country, we still have a large number of reptiles and amphibians.
Yeah, very, very cool. And your work touches upon habitat loss and how it impacts a lot of these species. Can you explain a little bit about what that looks like? What habitats do these creatures live in, and what's happening to that habitat over the last few years and decades?
Yeah, so the number one threat to reptiles, amphibians, and probably most wildlife in the world is the loss of habitat. And a lot of that has to do with either expanding agricultural areas and also urban areas. And because reptiles and amphibians are reaching their northern distribution limit in Canada, that means most of the species occur in the southern half of our country, which is also the place where human density is the highest. And so there's a conflict where most of the people live where the biodiversity of reptiles and amphibians are the highest. And so a lot of my work is trying to understand how that conflict plays out and how human land use affects these species.
Yeah. So how is it playing out, James? How many species have we lost? Have we lost any species? Have any species been extirpated or gone extinct here in Canada? And what's the status for these habitats? Like, is there positive news here, or is it all negative so far?
Yeah, so we've lost a handful of species, but right now the sort of focus is on protecting the species that we do have. And especially areas like Southern Ontario, where a lot of my work is, many of the reptiles and amphibians are threatened. So about half of the species that we have are at some level of risk, either endangered, threatened, or special concern. And so now we're trying to identify where those remaining populations are so that we can work together to protect habitat, but also to develop land responsibly so that we can keep those populations for future generations.
So I understand your work tries to find these rare species and habitats where you might not necessarily have actually found them before. How do you do that? What sort of black magic wizardry are you up to with a divining rod? Or like, how do you identify these places where these species might live without actually ever having seen them there?
So right now, a lot of my work is actually using community science, or citizen science, it's commonly called. So it's using the power of, people are out experiencing nature or even just in their yard, and they may encounter the species by chance or on purpose. And so I'm working with partners such as Ontario Nature that runs the Ontario Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, which is a program where people can submit sightings of these species. And so by using the power of having many different observers spread out across a very large space, then we can harness a large amount of data in order to identify places where species still are, or perhaps places where species are declining.
Very cool. So if I'm at home and I wanted to check out this atlas, I can obviously look that up. Is there an app? Are there programs that you could highlight for us that people could just use right now? If I left this broadcast and wanted to help find you some turtles, what could I use?
Yeah, so I'll send you the link. The atlas is very easy to find at ontarionature.org/atlas. And there's a field guide there with photos, maps, information about all the species that occur, at least in Ontario. Now, the atlas is winding down on data submission, but if you want to report sightings of reptiles, amphibians, or any species, I'd recommend using Inaturalist. And that allows you to submit sightings of any plant or animal anywhere in the world. You can use a mobile app or the web browser, and that's inaturalist.org.
I'm so glad you brought this up. I was going to feature it next. And I want, this is a perfect confirmation, because iNaturalist certainly touts itself as something where researchers can actually draw upon that data and use it for research and conservation purposes. So we're confirming that this is the case. This is usable, useful data that you guys can use, collected by the general public. Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, as a researcher, I'm only one person or a small team going out and collecting data, whereas using programs like iNaturalist or the Reptile Amphibian Atlas can harness thousands of observers across, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. So the power there is really great to be able to make inferences about, whether species are declining or not, or what sort of habitats they live in.
Yeah, very, very cool. Well, I'm going to head out and take some pictures when I'm done this broadcast, and I hope some other people do too. What are we doing as a government? What are we doing as a society to help protect these reptiles and amphibians? And are we doing a good job? Do you think it's been a positive trend in terms of how people have taken up the mantle of this challenge and actually done concrete action to save them, or not?
What I think it's important to acknowledge that there has been a lot of progress, especially recently, both in terms of protecting habitat, but also mitigating some threats, for example, using fencing or road crossing structures to allow species safe passage. However, I think there's a long way to go. And one of the main challenges is that, as you said, these species they're hard to find. So there's a lack of data in understanding how endangered certain populations or species are. And so part of the work I'm doing now is trying to identify where there are places that populations still exist in order to sort of direct that action of, okay, we can put in a management plan to try to protect habitat in certain areas, or to mitigate the threat of roads by putting crossing structures in a certain place.
So you mentioned road mortality, and this is something that I covered in a previous interview with Dr. Jackie Litska, so we'll link that in so people can do it as a nice connection to this talk today. Have there been any positive stories in finding sort of, not lost reservoirs or species, but any real positive stories of where we've taken concrete action that's led to some positive conservation outcomes, or where we found a group of species that we previously might not have known was in any location that you can share with us?
Yeah, sure. So I think in Dr. Litska's interview, she mentioned some of the crossing structures south of Sudbury. I'll mention another one in southwestern Ontario. That's where I'm originally from. There's a large number of endangered snakes, among many other unique species. And there's a relatively new overpass where there are endangered snakes, such as endangered eastern fox snakes, that are crossing back and forth across a large road using natural prairie grass on this sort of eco passage. And that's, I think, an example of, many different people and partners coming together to make something happen that's good for the species.
Very, very cool. I'm so glad to hear that. So, you talked about citizen science. People can go out, take these pictures, contribute to research. Is there anything else as a sort of a wrap-up question that people can do at home to help protect these ecosystems, protect these habitats, and make sure that there's homes for these species? Anything I can do to help, improve wetland health around Canada?
Well, I think, your vote is a very important way that you can sort of shape how governments and, our country, our towns, our province act in terms of endangered species and reptiles, amphibians, and conservation more generally. Besides that, choosing organizations that support similar values, that protect the things that are important to you. I think it's a good way to get involved that's separate than just reporting sightings or going out and volunteering your hand manually.
Yeah. You are the first person in any of these interviews to mention the importance of voting and the importance of those political decisions, which ultimately, affect habitat distributions, affect habitat decision-making more than anything else. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Paterson. I appreciate it. So thank you so much for joining in general. It's been a really nice opportunity to hear about a little bit of the work that's being done to protect reptiles and amphibians across Canada. And I appreciate you spending some time with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.